Hi folks, and welcome to this video on A Christmas Carol. So this is our first video. Let's just look at the very beginning. Right, so the very first page, you can see it starts by saying page 1. Okay, so although this is your front cover, this is actually page 1. So we are looking at A Christmas Carol, and it is a ghost story of Christmas. This is really important because in the 1800s, this would have been a kind of tradition to tell stories on Christmas Eve. Okay, so make sure that you've got that down. Not everybody could read or write, but someone that could read would tell this story on Christmas Eve. And so he wants to make it part of the Christmas tradition. He wants it to be read by so many people because this is such an important message. Okay, so we know this is a story about Christmas. It's about the true meaning of Christmas, and we know that Christmas is a time of being charitable, being kind. It's a time that we spend with our family, and it's a time of being giving. But it's also a time where we think about love and fun and food and singing, like Christmas carols and that kind of thing, and celebration. And Dickens wanted lots of people to read this story because it had such an important message. Okay, and that's also all of these things here, that he wanted people to be more like this and not like Scrooge. So here's where the story actually starts. I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book. Endeavoured means tried. I've tried in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea. So this is what he's saying. He's tried to raise an idea. And this is what he means by the kind of the meaning of the story, the idea or the message. Another word for it is the moral. What is it that he's trying to teach us? Which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. So he wants it to be a happy story, which we see with the happy ending. And he says, which shall not put my readers out of humour. So he didn't want to offend them. So he's saying this is not going to offend them. And this is really interesting because actually Dickens wanted to was going to write a report about the conditions for poor people in Victorian England, and actually by choosing to write a story rather than a kind of report that very few people would read, he actually reaches a lot more people with his message, and he's not kind of telling them off, and he's educating them about how to be different, how to live life differently, how to help others, but doing it in a happy way and an inoffensive way. And so this is kind of like his little starting bit to the story, because this is him here, Charles Dickens, his initials. Alright, so that's how he starts the story. If you need to get any more of that down, then you can pause the video and get that bit down first. Okay, so we're going to start and read the story. So it starts with stave 1, and a stave is just another word for a chapter. But if you're musical, you might know that a stave is one of those things. It's a long time since I've drawn one of these. It goes like that at the front of a piece of music. Okay, so it's also got this musical connotation. I'm just going to write that word down for you. Now remember, connotations means like what we associate with something. So musical associations, what it reminds us of. Alright, and the title of this chapter is Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon the change, for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now the change here is the stock exchange, and this was the kind of financial centre of London, but that's not really important, and you just got to understand that that's what it is. So what's going on here? Well, we've got Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. It's really important that Dickens sets that up in his mind, and Marley was as dead as a doornail. And so this then foreshadows Marley's ghost later, all right, which links to the title. So we can just put an arrow to there because it's foreshadowing. That means it's kind of predicting what's going on to begin with. He's trying to build up in our minds that there's no doubt whatsoever that Marley is a ghost when he comes back, because we know that he's definitely dead. So, paragraph 2. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Okay, so again we've got this simile here, this idea that he is literally a piece of metal. There is no life left in him. And that's what he's basically going on about there. He's definitely dead. And that's a good comparison because metal is cold, it's not living, it's hard, and we know that these are really good words as well to describe Scrooge. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, and his sole friend and his sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. Now, there's quite a lot of key information there. Okay, Scrooge is such an excellent man of business that he sorted the funeral out with an undoubted bargain. Now, this is his best friend, supposedly, and all he cares about is money. So this is where we see his greed and his miserly attitude. Remember, that means he's so focused on money that all he wants to do is get a bargain out of his friend's funeral. And we also know that they've got a lot of history together. They were partners for I don't know how many years. So we've got this kind of sense of history there. Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. And then we've got this repetition here as well. Scrooge was his sole executor, sole administrator, sole assign, sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. So this repetition here is really important. Now, we've met, obviously, because we've watched the film, we've met Jacob Marley as a ghost. We know what he's like. He made a lot of the same mistakes as Scrooge. So it's important, this word sole meaning only. The only person at his funeral was Scrooge. They would only have these friends to each other. He was the only person who kind of got everything from him in his will. So he had no one else to give anything to other than Scrooge. So it's important that Jacob is a lonely man who made the same mistakes as Scrooge. Let's read on. So obviously at any point if you need to pause to make more notes, then you can do. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If I were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play, there would be nothing more remarkable in taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his ramparts than there would be in any middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. So, maybe this tells us quite a lot about Scrooge, that he can't be bothered to do anything if it's not going to make him richer. Okay, so this won't make him richer, so it doesn't care. So if we put something like doesn't care because there's no financial gain. He doesn't even care if people get his name wrong. It was all the same to him. So he's not getting everything he needs out of life. He's alive, but he's not living, this man. So I'm going to put something like not engaging with life. He's withdrawn, I guess we could say. If it doesn't involve money, he's not bothered. So this is a really key bit of the text coming up, and we'll look at this in class. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature about him with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. And that's such a key bit. We're going to look at that in class together. Okay. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. So that's a kind of key quote there as well. So let's highlight that. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? Will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." So we've got a sense of his isolation here. So this whole section is telling us a lot about his loneliness and his isolation from others in society. Nobody ever stopped him in the street. Go back to using my highlighter. Nobody ever stopped him in the street. No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. So that bestow a trifle bit means asking him for money. So no beggars asked him for money because they knew that he wouldn't give it. And this is interesting as well, that even beggars, this kind of lowly, lowly people, even them, they don't want anything to do with Scrooge. No children asked him what it was o'clock. Now, if you remember when we talked about things before, Scrooge before, when we were watching the film, we said that he was quite intimidating and quite scary, okay? So they're scared, they're fearful, and they're intimidated by him. No man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way to such and such. So this really key repetition here of no, no, No. Right? Nobody wants anything to do with him. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and even they didn't want anything to do with him. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. What was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. So he wants to edge his way along the crowded paths of life. He is again this idea that he is isolated. His cruelty and his meanness have caused him his own pain really now. He just wants to be on the edge, not get involved. So if we note that down as well, that's kind of a good one. Not get involved in life. Once upon a time of all good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. Now his job is a creditor. He lends money to people, okay? So that idea of his job fits very neatly with the idea of him as a person. Holding on to money and sort of other people being dependent on him. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without, that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. So here we can see a lot of pathetic fallacy. All right, we've got the weather is cold, it's bleak, it's biting, that feeling of like when it's so cold it almost hurts your fingers. It's foggy. It's quite dark already. It had not been light all day. The air is brown and foggy. All right, so this kind of repetition, and we've also got dingy cloud as well. So the pathetic fallacy does a number of things. Now, as you should remember, pathetic fallacy is when the weather reflects the mood of the story. And if you need to write that meaning down, then pause the video and make sure you do it. So we've got weather that is cold and bleak and biting. Well, those words would be great to also describe Scrooge, wouldn't they? He is also cold and bleak and biting. He's nasty to other people. He kind of almost like a dog, snaps at them and doesn't want anything to do with them. He is cold in the sense that he's cold-hearted, and he's bleak. Bleak is sort of like empty. He's empty, devoid of emotion, this man. So this cold, bleak, biting weather is a really interesting way to describe Scrooge. And then this idea of fog as well. So fog prevents us from seeing things. We can't see very well. And I would say that metaphorically, at this point in the text, Scrooge can't see either. He is metaphorically blind. So if you need to note that down somewhere, then you can. Scrooge is metaphorically blind. And you might think, well, what do you mean, miss? What is it? We know he's metaphorically blind. Well, he's blind to the problems in society. He's blind to what's going on up here. That he's only hurting himself by his isolation. That even the beggars don't want anything to do with him. He's blind to the problems in society. He's blind to how badly he treats Bob Cratchit. He's blind to Fred and all these other sort of people in the novella. And also it's quite dark. It had not been light all day. Well, this is like Scrooge's life as well. Scrooge is dark. His life has not got any light in it. Remember, we talked about light already being a symbol of hope. So other people are putting candles in there. They've got this hope in their life. But we know that Scrooge probably wouldn't do that. He wouldn't want to waste it. But also we've got Dickens's own commentary on the Industrial Revolution here through this word, the brown air. So we know again the city is kind of polluted. But again, it's polluted literally by people, by the pollution from the factories, but it's also polluted metaphorically by people like Scrooge, who were greedy and damaging the city by their unwillingness to help others. Okay, let's move on. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep an eye upon his clerk, who was in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank with copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. By that he means he would fire them if the clerk, Bob Cratchit, tried to come in and get any more coal. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. So this is the first time that we meet Bob Cratchit, all right? We've got this idea that he keeps an eye upon his clerk, and so he's sort of spying on him, which isn't particularly nice. The clerk lives in a dismal little cell, a sort of tank, and these nouns here are really telling. So cell is a noun, and it's got this sense of him being like imprisoned in some way, or tank. This makes me think of like a fish in a tank, like an sort of like an animal, kept caged up. So the vocabulary is really helping us to understand their relationship. Scrooge had a very small fire, okay? We know that he's going to have a very small fire because he's mean and he's miserly and he doesn't want to waste money on something like that. But the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like only one coal. So this is telling us about how badly he treated his workers. Now remember what we've been looking at in terms of context. Obviously Scrooge could get away with treating Bob Cratchit like that, because if Bob Cratchit were to complain, Scrooge would just fire him. And he can't replenish it. That means he can't put any more, to replenish something you would put more on there. And he can't. And Scrooge keeps the coal box in his room, so again we've got this idea of control. And where it says the master it would be necessary for them to part, there's this sense of threat then hanging up. Scrooge's abuse of his power. We would see it as these days, but in those days that's just what bosses did. So the clerk has a comforter, which is like a big scarf. That's all he's got to try and warm himself at the candle. So again, this is telling us how poor Bob is. He doesn't have a proper coat. Okay, pause the video if you need to carry on with any of that. And then, look what happens here. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. So let's look at that already. Scrooge's nephew, Fred, is being described as cheerful. He has heated himself, despite the fog and frost. He's in a glow. His face was ruddy. That means red. He is handsome. His eyes sparkle, and all these things. His breath is noticeable. So we have got the sense of Fred being full of life. We know he's directly opposite to Scrooge. And lots of words that also we associate with warmth. Heated, glow, ruddy, cheerful. And it's almost like being a good person makes him good looking. So he's such a good person, he is handsome, as opposed to previously in the description of Scrooge there on the previous page, which is so different. "Christmas a humbug, uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "humbug." "Don't be cross, nephew," said the uncle, said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them a round dozen months presented dead against you. If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." Okay, so here we've got quite violent language that's showing his anger. He's saying that people should be boiled and buried with a stake of holly in their heart just for celebrating Christmas or for saying Merry Christmas. So these violent images are really showing how angry Scrooge is. He comes across as so angry and aggressive here. Okay, let's just turn back to the previous page as well, because we've still got a few notes to make there. So back to where we were before, and when we saw this bit in the video, I think it caused a little bit of confusion. So Scrooge says, "What right have you to be merry?" So he's basically saying, why are you happy? Like, why are you merry? Why are you happy? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. Now, this is from Scrooge's perspective, and Fred is not as rich as Scrooge, so therefore he sees him as poor. This is an example of Scrooge being pessimistic, being this kind of what we call a glass half empty person, focusing on the negative, seeing the bad rather than seeing the good. We know that Fred is actually rich, but Scrooge's point is, well, you could make more money. "Come then," the nephew returned gaily. So he kind of ignores him. He's oblivious. Gaily means happily. So he ignores Scrooge's negativity, and he says, "What right have you to be dismal, to be morose?" That means kind of like focused on the negatives. "You're rich enough." So we see Fred being optimistic. So this is where we see this real contrast between the two of them. Fred focusing on all the positives, and Scrooge focusing on all the negatives. And Scrooge then says down here, "Out upon Merry Christmas." He kind of refuses to accept it. And he says, "What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money?" Because obviously people had some time off, so he's not earning as much, but he's still got bills to pay. He's just getting older, but he's not getting any richer. So he doesn't see the point of Christmas, is the point of this bit here. Scrooge only cares about money. And he doesn't see the point of Christmas. Okay, so there's the first couple of pages of A Christmas Carol, annotated and analysed. You need to make sure that you have got all of that down. I'm going to do a separate video of that little section of Scrooge on page 2, and so you can watch that as well, please. Alright, but hopefully now you have everything you need for that, and then when you've watched this, you'll need to carry on watching videos for the rest of stage 1. Okay, I'll stop there for now.